Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm very happy to have Drs. López and Mariela Páez joining us for our webinar today on dual language learners in the early childhood classrooms. Before we start, I just have a few tips to go over. So first and foremost, if you have any applications open that use bandwidth, such as email or other web browsers, if you close those, that can help improve your viewing experience today. If you have any questions during this webinar, you can go ahead and enter those into the questions tab of your webinar panel, and then we'll take those at the end of the webinar. And if you'd like to minimize your webinar panel, there's a little orange arrow at the top of the panel. You can click that and it'll minimize the panel, and then you can click that again and it'll expand it. And if you have any audio issues during the webinar, you can switch to the phone call option in the audio tab of your webinar panel, and there's instructions for dialing in using your phone. So López and Mariela Páez are authors of the new book, Teaching Dual Language Learners, What Early Childhood Educators Need to Know. And in this book, early childhood educators get essential knowledge and strategies to support dual language learners in their classroom and to set them up for a lifetime of school success. And you can find more information about that at this URL here on your screen. And we are also doing a book giveaway for today's webinar. We're giving away 3 free copies of Teaching Dual Language Learners. So 3 attendees will be selected at random, and they'll be emailed after the webinar. And you can increase your chances of being selected by entering your questions, again, in that questions tab. And we're also having a survey at the end of our webinar. So at the end of the webinar, you'll be prompted to just complete the short survey, and if you just let us know, oops, I apologize for that, my dog is barking in the background. If you complete that survey and just let us know your thoughts on this webinar, you could be entered to win a free book as well. And finally, there are certificates of attendance that'll be available for all webinar viewers, and I'll cover that in a little bit more detail at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Drs. Mariela Páez and López.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this particular group of students we call dual language learners. DLLs are young children who speak a language other than English at home and are learning a second language. Since the 2000s, we have seen an increase in the total number of dual language learners in our educational system. DLLs make up nearly 1/3 of all young children in the United States, and they represent many different language backgrounds. Of course, the largest group are the Spanish speakers with 59%, but you also have Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Arabic languages represented in their homes. In addition to the increase of families and young children who are speaking a language other than English at home, we have also seen in recent years how DLLs make up a significant number of the children in early childhood settings. This means that we have DLLs in Head Start programs, childcare centers, private, public preschools, and early elementary grades. Lisa?
So today, our goals for this coffee chat are 4. First, it's to examine the beliefs about dual language learners' development and learning and the research that supports these beliefs. And these beliefs are coming straight from our book. We're also going to be exploring ways to provide effective support for dual language learners in the classroom, which will tie to some of these beliefs. We're going to discover connections between language and literacy development that are relevant for dual language learners. And we're going to learn practical instructional strategies for promoting language and literacy development in dual language learners. So our hope is that when you leave this webinar today, you'll have some more information regarding both the beliefs that go along with practices, as well as some strategies for providing instructional strategies for dual language learners in the classroom. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the beliefs that we discussed in the book. So in chapter 3 of the book, we really focus on the different beliefs or the different positive beliefs that really promote the responsive practices that we want to see in classrooms that serve dual language learners. It's important to really think about and reflect on what beliefs we bring into the classroom as teachers and how that impacts our practice. So teachers should continuously be reflecting on and examining their own beliefs. We've seen that teachers evolve in terms of their thinking about how children learn, how children develop, and how they practice some of these beliefs within the classroom. So you want to make sure you're asking yourself, do your beliefs align with your classroom practices? And we have this great questionnaire in the chapter 3 of our book that helps teachers to be able to do this, to reflect on your own beliefs and think about how practices align to those beliefs. So the 4 beliefs I'm going to be discussing today, you can see right there on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'll go into each of these in detail and talk a little bit about how we can align practices to relate to each of these beliefs. So the first belief that I want to talk about is that children are capable of successfully learning multiple languages. As many of us know, over half of the world's population is bilingual. What does that mean? Well, that means that most children can and do navigate different languages and cultures. So children have the cognitive capacity to be able to learn multiple languages and to be able to express themselves across multiple cultures. It's also important to know that learning multiple languages during childhood does not cause a language delay or an impairment. And this has been a belief that has been going on for quite some time now, and one that's still being expressed by pediatricians, some speech language pathologists. But it's important to know that this process of developing and learning multiple languages really is not what's causing a developmental delay or language impairment. Children who have a delay or impairment will typically have that delay or impairment in any of the languages that they're learning, whether they're learning one language or multiple languages. So the fact that children are learning multiple languages isn't what's causing a language delay or an impairment, and shouldn't be a reason to not introduce children to these multiple languages. And finally, we know that there's multiple successful methods for children to become bilingual. So it's not a one language, one person method anymore that really educators are advocating for, but instead it's more of a multiple languages approach. So children may speak multiple languages at home, may speak one language at home or at school, or might speak different languages both in school and in the community. So there really is not that one method that works for everybody, but instead we need to think about what works for specific children in the classroom based on the needs of that specific family and that specific child within that specific situation. And so again, that child might be exposed to multiple languages at home or in the community, or maybe speaking one language at home and one language at school. And any of these models can be effective in helping children to be successful in learning multiple languages. The second belief that we discuss in the book is quality and quantity of input are important for language learning. And Mariela will be talking a little bit more about language and literacy and some strategies to support language and literacy, but I just wanted to go briefly over some main ideas regarding quality and quantity. So as an adult, it's very important that when children are learning language, that we be intentional in terms of the vocabulary we're introducing, in terms of the way that we're speaking, whether we are providing contextualized information, so we're explaining information that's present for the child. So it's important to be both intentional, systematic, in terms of thinking about how to introduce different words, how to introduce the same words within different contexts. It's also important to be responsive to the child. So when the child speaks, we want to make sure that we're elaborating on what the child says, acknowledging what they're saying. And we also want to make sure we're using a language that we're comfortable speaking. When you're using a language you're comfortable speaking, you're more likely to use more complex language, more complex syntax, and vocabulary. And these are all important qualities in terms of language. Another piece within the quality of language is the interactions. So children really need rich interactions with adults in order to continue to develop language. And conversations are a great way for children to develop and extend their language. So having that back and forth interaction and engaging in a conversation around a similar topic really helps children's development of high quality language. And Mariela will talk a little bit more about some of these aspects of quality of language, but you can see quality language exposures in talking, singing, and reading with the child. So in addition to quality, we also have quantity. So obviously, it sounds obvious, but children need exposure to language to develop language. And when children are being exposed to multiple languages, it's important that they receive input in each of those languages in order to be able to build their language. So children's language growth really depends on the amount of input they're receiving in each of their languages. So they need to have input and exposure to a language in order to be able to fully develop in that language. And so that's an important piece when you're thinking about the child's exposure to multiple languages. The third belief is that the knowledge of a first language can really help support learning a second language. And again, Mariela may be talking a little bit more about this in terms of language and literacy, but I wanted to really bring your attention to this pyramid at the center of the screen, because it's a really nice way of thinking about how languages build on each other. Just like a foundation for a house builds a stronger house, a foundation in the first language will build a stronger second language. So you want to make sure a child's developing their first language as a foundation for general language development. A strong foundation in that first language will really help ease the transition into the child's development of the second language. And so you'll see in the middle is this idea that we're talking about as social language. So children start developing language in a much more social way and in a social environment. And so it takes children anywhere from 3 to 5 years to learn social aspects of a language. When to speak, what to say, how to speak to different people. And so while children may begin immediately speaking another language, it might take them several years to become proficient in that language. So if you have a new child come in and they start testing out the waters, that doesn't mean that they're fluent, but they're just starting to develop that other language. So it's important during this time that we continue to build the child's first language as that foundation for their development of the second language. And then as they're developing their social language, they also start beginning to develop their academic language. And so it takes about 5 to 7 years to develop enough academic English to engage in and participate in the school curriculum. Think about children who speak one language. In the US, they start kindergarten around age 5. And that's around the time that they've developed enough language to be able to handle a school curriculum. The same happens for children who are learning another language. It takes them 5 to 7 years to be able to be proficient enough in a language to be able to handle the curriculum that we're providing within a school environment. The final belief that I want to talk about today, and we have a few more in the book, is that both bilingualism and multilingualism have many linguistic, cognitive, and cultural benefits. And I just talked about the linguistic piece, right? So learning one language helps in the development of the second or even the third language, because many skills transfer across languages. So if you have a good foundation in one language, good skills in one language, as you're building vocabulary in the next language, you're able to transfer a lot of those skills without having to relearn. And therefore, there's a linguistic benefit in the fact that you've already learned something and you don't need to relearn it. You just apply what you know from one language in developing your skills in the other language. And these are called metalinguistic skills. We've also found some research that there's cognitive benefits. And some of this research is controversial, but what we've really found is that the more children are speaking multiple languages, the better the child is able to have skills such as planning and regulating their behavior, thinking flexibly, which really helps with their problem-solving ability, and also inhibitory control. So they're able to inhibit, or they're able to control themselves from saying something. And the reason they can do this is if they're bilingual, then they know who they're speaking to and what language, and they're able to inhibit their use of one language and using the other language. They're able to also transfer those skills to other aspects and other areas of their life. And finally, there's a social emotional benefit to this as well. Children who are able to continue to communicate with family members, are able to develop more cultural competence, and they're able to strengthen their own sense of self and their own identity. And research shows that children who have better sense of self and better identity get along better with others and have stronger social emotional skills. So the cultural competence piece and the identity piece are extremely important in helping children build their social emotional skills. And so all of these are aspects that are really beneficial for children as they're developing, and we're seeing that children who are bilingual or multilingual are benefiting even further in these aspects than monolingual children. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mariela, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about language and literacy.
Thank you, Lisa. Indeed, the beliefs that Lisa just discussed are the foundation for your practices. In our book, we offer suggestions for practices, general classroom practices, and we have one entire chapter for language and literacy skills. Actually, Lisa, go back a second. Let me tell you about why is it that we have one chapter just for language and literacy skills. Definitely, this is one of the most important areas, domains that children are learning in early childhood, and supporting dual language learners in acquiring reading and writing skills. It's going to be one of the greatest accomplishments during the early childhood years. And how do we start supporting our dual language learners' literacy and language development? Well, now we can go to the model. We start by understanding how children develop as skilled readers. What is it that children need to learn in order to read successfully? I like this model. Lisa and I included this model in the book. We both like it because it shows the developmental picture of the simple view of reading. This model by Dr. Hollis Scarborough is called the reading rope, and it shows the complexity of learning how to read and the many skills that are involved in reading. There's a strong relationship between language and early literacy. Learning how to read and write really starts with language. And here in the model, you can see the top is the language piece, and then we have the early literacy skills. What does this mean for dual language learners? DLLs are learning in skills in 2 languages. And as Lisa mentioned, skills in one language can contribute to skills being learned in the other language. They need to integrate these numerous skills in order to learn how to read in one or multiple languages. For us educators, teachers, it means that we need to focus on all these different areas, not just the phonological and decoding skills, which lead to word recognition, and you see them at the bottom of the model, but also in the larger and more difficult areas, such as vocabulary, literacy knowledge, verbal reasoning. And together, children are integrating these skills that then lead to fluent execution and coordination and reading. Next, I want to show you what are some of the strategies that we discuss in our book. Lisa, the next slide. We talk about these different strategies, and we elaborate on examples for each of these strategies that you need to make sure that you're including this in your teaching, in your curriculum, in your classrooms. First, a focus on language development and extended vocabulary. We need to establish this rich linguistic and literacy environments that are going to support both language and literacy, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Second, we need to foster children's phonological awareness. And this is critical in the early childhood years, especially when children are learning about the sounds in their language or multiple languages. We also know from research that students can transfer skills, phonological awareness skills. Actually, Lisa has a couple of studies that have shown this potential of transfer in phonological awareness between English and Spanish. It's a very useful tool that we can use and encourage with bilingual children. Third, we need to integrate instruction on letter identification, decoding, and word recognition skills. All of this are activities and lessons that we can integrate into our daily curriculum. Fourth, we need to support learning about book concepts and print knowledge. I love the quote by Jean Shaw at Harvard. She said that if we want children to learn about words, then we need to expose them to books, because books is where the words are. Totally true. Also, if we want to encourage students to know how to read books, how to engage with print, we need to have that exposure to a diversity and a variety of books. Fifth, we need to engage students in early writing. There's been a lot of focus on language and literacy, more so than in early writing, but writing, it's a very important piece and is connected to oral language in the early childhood years. Children are learning about the connections between language and print, and then they need to be immersed in that experience of writing. Think about providing access to a variety of materials, including different types of paper, markers, crayons, color pencils, blank books or journals, labels, stamps, even envelopes that they can write letters to their friends and family. When you include all of these writing materials in the classroom, children are going to be more motivated and they're going to engage in early writing. One final point is that you can focus on all these strategies and build all these skills while also supporting home languages. Home language. Educators can support home languages even if they don't know the home language or the languages of all their children in their classroom. Of course, if you're a bilingual, multilingual teacher, you're better able to do this, and you can incorporate the student's language in your instruction for scaffolding. You can even plan lessons using multiple languages. But if you're not knowledgeable in all the languages that your students are bringing with them to your classroom, don't worry, because you can still support language in the classroom, and their language in particular. I'm going to tell you a little bit more how to do that in our next slide. When thinking about language development and vocabulary, Lisa mentioned this, but it's so important that you think about a focus that is intentional on language and vocabulary. You have to think about how you're using language in the classroom, how you're introducing students to new words, and vocabulary has been found to be one of the best predictors of comprehension in later years. So vocabulary is one of these areas that we all need to emphasize in our teaching. Research has shown, research that both Lisa and I have done with bilingual students, but research that other scholars have done on vocabulary has shown that children start the early years with significant variation in the number of vocabulary words that they understand, the receptive vocabulary, and the number of words that they can produce, their expressive vocabulary. And it is for this reason, that large variation that we find in the early years, that you need to be really intentional and plan carefully to expose and present to children lots and lots of vocabulary. When we research early childhood classrooms that are doing an excellent job in language development and vocabulary, we found that these classrooms include high quality interactions where they're engaging children in hearing and using different words. It's not just about hearing them, you have to use the words. Children make the meaning of the words more active when they're using the words. We need to focus on having these back and forth conversations. They can be back and forth conversations between the teachers and the children, between the children themselves, but these opportunities to practice language, to develop new words in context, and to use a diversity of vocabulary words. Teachers can scaffold language learning in the classroom, and they can think about their interactions as a way of confirming, recasting, and elaborating children's language. Finally, we can plan for activities that we know are going to encourage language development and vocabulary learning, such as reading books, listening to stories, and singing. As I mentioned before, we can create this rich linguistic environments, and we can do it while supporting home languages. Activate children's background knowledge. What they know, what they bring with them to the classroom is a fantastic tool that you can use in teaching and learning. There's the possibility of transfer. Lisa explained that so well. I'm not going to elaborate because she did a wonderful job explaining how students can use both of their languages to learn. And then one thing that we've seen exemplary teachers doing is using children as experts in the classroom. Let's say you're an educator and you don't know the home language of some of your students in the class, but you know that children can use this language and use this language at home. You can bring them as experts in the classroom. You can ask them about vocabulary words in their home language, about how they say something at home if they use that word, or how they have learned perhaps in multiple dialects to say the same thing, the same concept that you're teaching them. And finally, leveraging resources in the community, including families. We have seen how teachers invite community members into the classroom and talk to parents and families about contributing to the language learning in the class. I want to share with you an example that Lisa and I wrote about in our book, and this is just one of the many examples and practices that we are sharing in our book for teaching dual language learners. We picked this example today because we were talking about vocabulary, and we thought, why don't we share some of the strategies for read alouds and how the read alouds can be focused on teaching language and vocabulary. And so I want to share with you this example of using the book Click, Clack, Moo, Cows That Type. It's a favorite book of early childhood educators, and it's very complex and rich in the vocabulary that the book is presenting. When you're planning your read aloud lessons, include activities before you read the book, during the read alouds, and then after reading the book. And those activities and your read aloud can focus on developing the oral language and vocabulary that is connected and that is salient in the book. In Click Clack Moo, this kindergarten teacher is identifying a few vocabulary words that she knows are difficult for the children, and she's pre-teaching that vocabulary because it is going to be a difficult and hard word in the context of the book, but she's going to pre-teach the definition of the words. For example, if you're reading Click Clack Moo, you can pre-teach vocabulary words such as exchange, ultimatum, and strike. And if you're pre-teaching, you define the word for the students using child-friendly definitions that they'll be able to understand. This is important. Child-friendly definitions are difficult because a lot of times we want to define particular words, but how you define the words needs to be carefully crafted so that students will be able to understand it, especially dual language learners. Let me give you an example. To define the word strike in Click Clack Moo, I would probably show a picture of a strike, something like this. And then I would say, in this picture, we see the word strike. When there's a strike, workers stop working for a while to try to get something they want or need from their job. That's a child-friendly definition. And then you start reading the book, and you might ask students to connect to their background knowledge about topics in the book. And so here, in the case of Click, Clack, Move, the teacher might ask children if they have been in a situation where they've seen a strike or where they've seen somebody demanding something. And once you allow children to talk about the words and connect to their background knowledge, you can start reading the book, and you can emphasize or highlight the words when they appear in the book. In this way, you can again define the word, but you can do it in the context of the story and the reading. After you finish the read aloud, you can plan activities to reinforce the learning of the read aloud. You can plan a retell activity with pictures from the book, or a matching card game. I love that, when you can create a game and have students play to learn new vocabulary and reinforce what you were reading in the book. You can also plan center activities that extend the topics and the themes of the book and encourage dual language learners to interact with one another, to use the words, maybe to work in pairs or in a small group, or even just one-on-one with the teacher. This is an example of an activity that we engage in all the time. Teachers are always reading books, but it's an example of an activity that can be intentionally crafted to teach vocabulary for dual language learners. One last piece that I'll give you a highlight from our language and literacy chapter has to do with assessment. Lisa, actually, we have a whole chapter just on assessment, but for this webinar today, I'm just going to give you a highlight of assessment of language and literacy skills. In early childhood education, we know that assessment needs to be systematic, developmentally appropriate, and use multiple sources of data. That includes observation and screening measures so that we know how every child is doing in the classroom. What are their strengths? What are some areas that we need to develop and that we need to plan for in our curriculum? Assessing skills in the languages that children are exposed to and the languages that children know is very important. This will allow you to not just plan, but allow you to focus very specifically and target instruction for those children that you have in the classroom. If you're teaching in 2 languages, then you need to assess skills in 2 languages. Lisa and I always discuss that you want to assess the languages of instruction. So in bilingual programs, you definitely want to assess in both the languages that you're using for instruction. And if let's say that you're teaching in English, but your students get support for their home languages, you can also assess the home language and make sure that the child is developing according to age and grade level norms. A second point about assessment has to do with the connection to curriculum. You want to assess learning that is connected to the curriculum and teaching in the classroom, so then the DLL children have the opportunity to learn those skills. Finally, a word about assessment. Engage families when you're assessing language and early literacy skills. As Lisa mentioned earlier, when students develop a language delay or you are trying to identify a special need, it's always the case that they're going to show this delay in both of their languages, not just in English if you're teaching in that language. And this is why it's so critical to find out more information about the home language. We have several tools that we present in the book that can help you assess in home languages. And we also have a whole chapter to how to work and engage families as you're teaching your dual language learners. And so I hope that this information that we have shared with you today gives you a little sense, some highlights from what our work is in this book. And I hope that you continue to learn about how to be more effective with dual language learners.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Mariela and Lisa. That was a fantastic presentation. So we got quite a few questions in. Just going through here. Let's see. So again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and enter those into the questions tab of your webinar panel. Sorry, I'm just reading questions here. Okay, so we have a listener that was asking, how do you help other students understand that communication with dual language learners may take some patience?
Excellent question. Lisa, you want to get started or you want me to start?
I can start. That's fine. That is a great question. I think children are more tolerant than we give them credit for. So I think children in the classrooms I've seen, at least, and I've been in a lot of classrooms, we see that the children do recognize when other children are different, and the differences are actually a good thing. And so having conversations about the different languages and how children speak different languages and how great it is, and helping children to be excited about being exposed and having the opportunity to engage with children in other languages, and having that child serve as an expert in terms of, oh, they can possibly teach us a couple of words as well, is a great way to get the children to be connected and really engage. And so I think explaining to them that as you're learning language, what that process looks like, and that it took you some time to learn English, and if they have younger siblings, helping them understand that their younger siblings are maybe learning a new language, learning English. So in the same way, this child already speaks a whole other language, but is also learning English. And so giving them some of that information. You can do social stories as well with children. Those are great for helping children to problem solve and learn new information, is providing social stories, reading books about children coming in that speak other languages. And there's a lot of books out there. I can't think of any right now, but I know there are books, children's books out there about different cultures within the classroom. I know Alma Flor Ada has several of those types of books that really engage children in thinking about multiple languages. So there's many different ways to do that, so that we can really value, and so other children can see the value in that child bringing in their language, and then those children serving as English experts that can help that child learn English as well.
Yeah, I agree. Excellent points, Lisa. And I just want to add that Lisa and I had as our mentor Patton Tabors, who wrote One Child, Two Languages, and she was a fabulous scholar in the field of early childhood and bilingualism. And Patton always used to say that something that we can do in our classrooms that would help the dual language learners is not to keep it a secret. It's never, shh, oh, Miguel doesn't speak English. No, it's, listen, Miguel speaks a language other than English at home. His parents speak only to him in Spanish, and he's now coming to the classroom and he's going to learn English. And as Lisa said, talking about the dual language learners in the classroom and doing it from an asset perspective, saying this is something fantastic and wonderful. And I think that helps other children develop that patience that it requires, because you're right, it does require patience, especially when you're trying to share materials and toys. Yes, but excellent, great suggestions, Lisa. Another question, Daniel.
Let's see, we have another listener who says that they're an early interventionist who works with a mother that speaks 3 languages. And she said that her son does have a language delay, so she was hesitant to introduce other languages because she thought it may be confusing. So she was wondering if you have any advice or suggestions for that situation.
Yes, excellent question. In the book, we have in the chapter of assessment, we have a whole section where we talk about special needs in the context of bilingualism and multilingualism. And one of the myths that I think exists in the field in education is that if you have a special need or if your language delay, you cannot be bilingual. And that's a myth. That's not true. In fact, you can still be bilingual, multilingual, even if you have a language delay or a language disorder. It would require more time and intervention and definitely attention to the particular special need, but you can still develop as a bilingual and multilingual. I think one of the things that we discuss in the book and one of the things that is very important is that when identifying the special need, that you're making sure that you're conducting valid, reliable assessments in all languages. And if it's an issue of exposure, then you need to make sure that the child is receiving enough input to develop that language. If it's an issue of processing, then you're talking about a different type of intervention. But it all starts with screening, assessment, taking a look at how much exposure the child is having to each of the languages, and then providing the support necessary so that the child can continue to be bilingual, multilingual. Lisa, you want to add?
I'm going to add to that. Yeah, that's absolutely right, Mariela. And I agree. I think assessment is an important piece. We need to make sure we're doing assessments with valid and reliable instruments, but we also need to think about where the language delay or impairment is. And so that delay might actually appear in one language more so than another, depending on the type of delay or impairment they have. And so making sure you're working within each of the child's languages to make sure that they're receiving what they need. And usually, if you're able to pinpoint what the impairment or delay is and in which language it's strongest in, by intervening in that one language, it can actually help transfer the skill over to the other languages as well, so that children, once they're able to I don't
strengthen.
know
No, I think that's great. Once they strengthen that language,
once they strengthen, thank you, I couldn't find the word. That's why Mariela and I work so well together. She can finish my sentences. So once they strengthen that piece in that own language, it'll start showing up as stronger in the other languages as well. But you have to be very intentional about it. And so really identifying which language you should be intervening in and how that will impact their development in the other languages. But they absolutely will not confuse the child in any way.
Definitely.
Daniel, more questions?
Great, thank you. Yes, we have plenty more. Let's see. We had a listener who asked, what is recasting as scaffolding? So can you elaborate on that,
Oh, yes.
that idea?
For sure.
Mariela?
We wrote actually an example of a recast in an elaboration in the book, and it was Lisa's idea. I think this is an actual conversation that she had with one of her kids. Lisa, it was the example where you were talking about cake. Remember that dialogue of cake in the book? It was such a beautiful example.
So I have it right here, and I can share it with you all. So the teacher, and actually I witnessed this in the classroom. So the teacher says, "What are you making today?" And the child says, "Cake." And the teacher says, "You're making a cake. What kind of cake is it?" The child says, "Birthday cake." The teacher says, "Oh, a birthday cake. I love celebrating birthdays. Whose birthday is it?" The child says, "My birthday." The teacher says, "You're making a cake for your birthday? What flavor are you making the cake?" The child says, "Chocolate." The teacher says, "Chocolate's also my favorite flavor for cake. Let's invite our classmates to come celebrate your birthday. What else do you think we should have at a birthday party along with the cake?" And so you see the child only has sufficient vocabulary to give 1 or 2 word answers. And the teacher is recasting that, saying that the child's answer, but adding to it and building on it. So scaffolding that child. So continuing to ask them questions. And this is also a great example of those conversations we're talking about to help promote high quality interactions. So that back and forth interactions with the child. So the teacher could have said, "Oh, you're building a cake. All right, that's great. See you later. I'm going to go over here and talk to this other child. But instead, they're staying there, engaging the child, scaffolding their language, adding new words for them, as well as recasting what they said, saying it in a different and a new way to provide them with new high quality language.
Yes, and the reason why I love that example is because it's a situation that often happens in early childhood classrooms, whether the students are playing with Play-Doh or in the water table or with sand. They're always building and imagining things. And so those are perfect opportunities to build their language skills. And when Lisa was reading, I don't know if you were able to capture this, but at one point, the teacher is connecting the few words that the child was able to say. The teacher is connecting them and putting them together in a sentence. And so that's really recast and elaboration. Great example. Thank you. I think we had time for more and more questions.
Yep. Yeah, we have time for a few more.
Oh, we're going. We'll be quicker.
Let's see. We have a reader who said, since it is important for a child to have a solid foundation in one language to then more easily pick up a second language, in the infant toddler stage, is it recommended to focus on one language first, or can families work on multiple languages at the same time?
Let me start, and Lisa, you can finish. I think that all children can learn multiple languages in a simultaneous way. So you can introduce more than one language simultaneously to children, and they'll learn both languages as long as they're getting enough exposure, that's input, and they have the opportunity to practice that language. So it's not the only way. It's not just to focus on one language and then the other. That's what we call sequential bilingualism. You can also have simultaneous bilingualism, where you're introducing multiple languages at once. There are cases of research where families decide on the one parent, one language model to make sure that they are providing enough exposure to students. And it is effective, it's an effective strategy, but it's not the only strategy, and it's not something that you need in order to raise a bilingual child.
Right. And so like what I was saying in terms of the beliefs that children can be multilingual, there's a lot of different effective models for doing that. And so the piece of the language foundation is really geared more towards those sequential learners. So children who've learned only one language and they start developing a new language when they go into an early childhood center, maybe at 3. When you have those infants and toddlers, what we're seeing is that simultaneous bilinguals is even better, right? Because they're learning multiple languages at the same time. And what we see is they have the same milestones across the different languages at the same time. So being able to learn multiple languages together, it's even more effective and more efficient than learning one language and then another, because it's just like learning one language, but you're learning multiple languages. So as long, again, as you have the input and sufficient input in each of those languages, absolutely. And you see a lot of communities around the world where children are born and they are introduced to multiple languages and are learning multiple languages from the time that they're born. And it really helps with just their fluency and their thinking and their native ideas.
And research now shows that as young as 2, when the children are 2 years old, they are able to tell the difference between the 2 languages that they're learning, the simultaneous bilingual speakers, and they're able to identify different language with different individuals in their context, whether they're at home or in the community. So young children, infants and toddlers, are able to distinguish between languages. They are able to connect the languages to the speakers. And sometimes they mix the language, and that's okay too. Parents ask this all the time, right, Lisa? They ask, my child is mixing up their 2 languages. Does that mean that they're confused? Is that a sign of delay? And no, code switching and mixing, I think, is part of the developmental process of learning multiple languages at the same time.
Absolutely. And if I can add to that, I know we said we were going to be short, but lots of good information is our brains are actually set up to speak multiple languages. And so we have synapses set up in our brains that really can help us develop the sounds of those languages. And those start disappearing as early as 10 months. So the earlier you start introducing multiple languages, the better it is for brain development in terms of being able to house all of those different languages in the language area of your brain and really engage your brain's wiring to be wired to speak multiple languages.
I love when you talk about the brain. There's so much new research on neuropsychology, on bilingualism, and we're getting now, it seems like every month, a new study that is helping us learn more about how the brain works and how young children are learning languages. So yes, we included it in the book, by the way.
Yeah.
Let's see, we had a few listeners, so I'm going to kind of combine a few questions here. We had a few listeners that were saying they work with children in their classroom where there's multiple different languages. One listener said they have 7 different languages in their classroom.
Ooh, yes.
So do you have any tips or strategies for kind of engaging all of those students and, you know, if possible, including those languages in instruction?
Definitely. We have a section in the book where we talk about super diverse classrooms. This is how now some of this context where there's many different languages represented, as many as 8 or 10 different languages represented in a classroom. They're labeled sometimes with this term, super diverse classrooms. And Megina Baker and I have done some work looking at strategies in some of those super diverse classrooms. And Lisa also has done some of this work in Head Start classrooms that oftentimes have more than one language represented among the children. And I think what's important is this acknowledgement that there are multiple languages, and then for the teacher to think about using the children themselves as experts in order to support the home language. One example I'll give you, one classroom that we visited in our research, the teacher had decided that there were so many languages represented that she was going to do a wall in her classroom, and she was going to put little houses with pictures of the children's family and the language that they spoke at home. And so when you walked into this classroom, the first thing you would see is all these little houses with all the family pictures and the different languages that the family spoke at home. And then in the class, she would ask families to contribute with books or labels for her classroom. There was a family that even brought the alphabet in their home language to be shared in the writing center next to the English alphabet. And so by asking families to participate, to contribute to the classroom, by showcasing the children and families, you're including their language and culture.
You can even have the families record information that you can, or stories, or saying oral stories in their home languages, and you can play those in the classroom so that if you as a teacher don't speak all 7 of those languages, you can still incorporate those languages into the classroom through audio or having videos of the families engaging in oral storytelling or communicating information in those different languages to really showcase each of the languages within the classroom, particularly around the different units that you're doing in class.
Great, another excellent answer. Let's see. We have a couple of listeners that were asking if a family is bilingual, do you recommend or suggest that the families continue to speak both languages at home?
Definitely. Mariela and I are both nodding our heads, yeah.
That's a quick one. Absolutely. Yes. Lisa said something earlier in the presentation when she was presenting about the beliefs. Lisa explained that families should speak the language that they feel most comfortable in, the language in which they can provide the richest linguistic input to their children. And if they speak 2 languages, then they should speak both languages at home. And the idea is that you are building children's skills in those languages. And, you know, there's going to come a time, it happened to me with my own children, where I was speaking only Spanish at home, and I had strict rules. We're going to speak Spanish at dinner times, Spanish at home. But when they were attending mostly English classroom, an English school, when they came home, they wanted to speak more English. They were not so thrilled that I only wanted to speak Spanish with them, but I insisted. And you have to have a plan, and you need to make sure that you continue exposing them to the language. And now my kids, they're both in college, and they appreciate their bilingual skills. And they say to me, thank you for making me speak Spanish and for forcing me to continue using that language, because now they're older and they understand the value of bilingualism in a way that they couldn't when they were younger and they were immersed in an English only school.
Let's see, we have a couple of listeners that are also asking, is it, oops, I just lost my place here. So they're asking, do you agree with the idea that it's more important to focus on the home language during the first 3 years of a child's age, and then from there moving on into learning a second language?
That's a difficult question.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think that if the child has the input and good and high quality input in multiple languages, then what we know from the neuroscience research is that children should be exposed to the multiple languages. If they're going to be receiving higher quality language in their first language and subpar in English, then I think I would stick to more English. So like if the parent is deciding, should I be speaking to my child in my home language and in broken English, or just my home language, I would go with my home language. But if you're in a situation where their child is receiving high quality language input in multiple languages, I think it's beneficial for the child to be hearing those languages from early on, based on what we know from neuroscience research.
I would add that, yeah, I'm going to add that many years ago, before early childhood education and early childhood classrooms were so prevalent, children would be home for 3, 4, sometimes even up to 6 years, and then they would enter the school, and they, in the case of the United States, they would learn English in the classroom, right? And some lucky children would go to bilingual programs and could learn in more than one language. And so that model of you develop a strong foundation in first language and then you learn a second language, that model was something that was popular, but a long time ago. Now, in the dynamics of early childhood education, what we see is that children are entering centers and home day care centers. You know, it can be a home family care or a center-based care, but they're entering at a much younger age, as 2-year-olds, as 3-year-olds. So they don't have that time to just focus on one language and then learn the other. They're probably going to be learning simultaneously both languages, right? The language of the school or daycare and the language of the home. And that's okay. I think what research shows is that it takes time for children to develop in multiple languages. It requires quantity and quality of exposure, as Lisa mentioned earlier. And you need to give children, the opportunity to develop the language. And so I would say that it's not necessary to only focus on one language for the first 3 years of life. It's not necessary. If you do it, I think students will start learning a second language with a strong foundation, but it's not something that is necessary. They can learn 2 languages even from birth.
And I want to reiterate what Mariela said. It does take time, so you shouldn't just expect children to learn a language from one day to another. It really does take, whether you're learning 1 language or 2 languages, it does take a lot of time to learn language. So you want to make sure you're realizing that.
5 to 7 for academic language, 3 to 5 social language. So it takes time. I'm glad you mentioned the years, Lisa, because I think it's important. Sometimes we think children are just going to absorb it and they're so quick, but it takes time to develop the type of sophisticated language, academic skills that children need for today's schooling.
And I've had teachers say, oh, this child just started in September, it's December, they're already fluent in English. But they're not. They're tricking you, right? So they have a couple key words that they're able to interject to make you think that they can speak English, but they don't. The fluency is not there, and the proficiency is not there.
Definitely. So something to be aware of in your observations, in your assessments, also in your curriculum as you're planning and designing your teaching environments. You need to make sure that you're capturing how children are developing in their languages.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. So we have a couple of listeners that are asking if you could provide some tips or strategies or ways that educators can encourage parents to advocate for their child to learn multiple languages.
So tips for educators to advocate or for the children? Tell me that again.
So tips for the educators to encourage parents to advocate for their child to learn multiple languages. It's a little convoluted, but
no, it is so important, this question.
Right.
Because
I've had a lot of parents tell me that, oh, I want my child to learn English and then they can learn their home language later. So I think that's a really valid question. Somebody, did you want to answer it?
No, the way I see it, when I've worked with families here in Massachusetts, I'm near Boston, Massachusetts, and when I worked with families here in Massachusetts, we were working under a policy environment that was very difficult for bilingual families because we eliminated bilingual education in Massachusetts around 2002. We have recently brought it back, thank God. We're bringing back bilingual education. But in that environment, when we eliminate bilingual education, when there was so much emphasis on English only, parents were worried that their children were not learning English quickly enough. And they would ask me, should I switch to English at home? Should I be talking in English at home? Because they were worried that their children wouldn't be ready for school if they didn't use English at home. And the truth is that, no, you shouldn't worry about introducing English or speaking English at home, because if the children are going to be immersed in an English environment at school and in the community, they're going to learn English for sure. I would tell parents to worry about their home language, because that's what they needed to protect and make sure that students were learning, that their children were continuing to learn and speak in that language. And so I've always talked to parents and families about the importance of the transfer that Lisa was talking about. The foundation on the first language is going to help with English and continuing to be bilingual because of all the benefits that we mentioned today: cultural benefits, cognitive benefits, and definitely social benefits.
I agree. I think informing parents and giving them the tools that they need in terms of knowing what the research says and knowing about these beliefs and why it's so important to be bilingual will really help parents to be able to be better advocates. Parents are hearing from pediatricians, or, as I said before, from speech pathologists, that they should be speaking English to their children. And so parents need to be better advocates of bilingualism. And if they have the tools and if they have the knowledge, that can really help them be better advocates for themselves and for their children. So telling them a lot of what we just told you all today, translating the book for them. There's a whole section on there's a whole chapter on working with families that really touches on to these ideas as well. And so making sure that they have that information.
Lisa, I was just thinking about that chapter and even that infographic. If you're a teacher and you want parents to be advocates, you can print that infographic that Lisa presented today about the beliefs, and you can give it to parents and you can say, oh, I was in this great webinar and they shared with me this, I wanted to share it with you. And that parent gets that information, and next time somebody tells that family that they should maybe switch to English or they should use more English at home, that family can just bring out the infographic and be like, no, multilingual, yes.
I think we're getting near the end of our time, but we did get a few questions from listeners that were asking about American Sign Language, or ASL. And so there were a few listeners that were saying they work with children whose primary home language is ASL, but the children themselves are verbal. So do you have any strategies or tips, or are there any unique challenges that these children may face that teachers can help support them?
There are definitely unique challenges facing ASL speakers, American Sign Language. And I have to say that this work, Lisa and I, we don't have a particular chapter on this topic in the book, but we do have colleagues that do this work. And I wanted to mention the work of Liana Pizzo, Pizzo. She's an expert in this area of American Sign Language and bilingual families. And what Liana always says is that we need to understand that American Sign Language is different than sign language in other languages, right? So if you're a Spanish-speaking family, for example, that is using sign language in Spanish, that's going to be different than American Sign Language. And so being aware that multilingualism and bilingualism can vary across sign language is important. The other piece that is really critical is when research has looked at multilingualism for these families that are using sign language, what they found is that there's some delay when parents are hearing parents and the children are only know sign language and they're not hearing. The children can experience some delay in language, and that's because of exposure. So because the parents themselves are not signing, they need to learn how to sign, and then they can expose their children to sign language. And so when we look at families that have parents that use sign language and the children use sign language, there's no delays there. But when parents are hearing parents and it takes a while for them to learn sign language, there might be a delay in terms of exposure. But then you, as a family, you can learn sign language and catch up.
And then to add to that, if you think about sign language in terms of as a gesture and communication mechanism, we see that there is research that shows that sign language can also serve as a foundation for learning other languages. And so that idea of the first language being a foundation for multiple other languages also applies for ASL. So there's still aspects of ASL that really bring in that metalinguistic quality that helps transfer skills to other languages. And so it's still seen as an asset in building up ASL and the use of ASL in learning other languages.
Okay, so I think we've reached towards the end of our time. So there were a handful of questions that we were unable to answer, so we can follow up with those listeners after the webinar.
For sure, and we probably have it in the book.
The book is filled with excellent knowledge that can probably answer a lot of these questions as well, yes. So just a quick reminder, there will be a survey at the end of this webinar. If you complete that, just let us know what you thought about this webinar and you'll be entered to win a free book as well. We are also extending an offer to all of our webinar viewers. You can save 20% on any of your orders at brookspublishing.com just using the code COFFEECHAT. And if you are looking for additional professional development opportunities, excuse me, at this URL here, we have tons of previous Coffee Chat webinars, and we have several upcoming webinars as well. So if you're looking for additional professional development opportunities, you can check out what we have recorded and what we have upcoming. And I think finally, oh, no, we have, so We also have COVID-19 resources that are available for early childhood educators. This includes recommended reading, downloadable resources, and additional professional development webinars. These are just resources that we've pulled together to help educators navigating this pandemic, as it's really shifted everyone's work. And so you can access those resources here at this URL here. And then I think we have one more slide. Yes, okay. And then here you can get your certificate for attendance for this webinar. In the handout section, there is a certificate that you can download there. Or if that's for whatever reason not working, you can also access your certificate at this URL here. And then just a reminder as well, this webinar is recorded. So tomorrow afternoon, you'll receive a follow-up email that'll have a link to the recording of this webinar. And I think that should be it. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of our viewers today, and then also a huge thank you to Mariela and Lisa for this presentation. It was fantastic, so much information. So thank you both.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.